The letter arrived on a Tuesday morning in the autumn of 1873, carried by a dust-covered rider along the sun-scorched trail into Redemption Creek, Colorado. And when rancher Jesse Weston read the final line, his hands trembled so badly he nearly dropped it into the fire. Asterisk, I am not what you are expecting, Mr. Weston. I am not beautiful. I am not young, and I have known sorrow that would break most men. But I will work hard, I will not complain, and I will never ask you to love me. Asterisk, he had read 100 letters in his 41 years on this earth. None had ever made him weep. If you believe in second chances, in the power of kindness, and in the quiet miracle of love, finding broken people in broken places, like this story, share it with someone who needs hope today, and subscribe so you never miss another story that moves your soul. Jesse Weston had not always been a hard man. There was a time, long before the war and the drought and the fever that stole his first wife, Margaret, that he had been the kind of man who laughed easily, who sang off-key on Sunday mornings, and who believed with his whole chest that God was good and life was generous. That man had died somewhere between the battlefield at Chickamauga and the winter of 1867, when he buried Margaret beneath the old cottonwood on the eastern edge of his ranch, while a Colorado blizzard howled across the plains like something mournful and alive. He had stood at that grave for a long time, hat in his hands, snow gathering on his shoulders, and he had made a quiet, terrible promise to himself that he would never again allow anything soft to live inside him. Softness, he had decided, was simply another word for a wound waiting to happen. For 6 years after Margaret's passing, Jesse ran the Weston Ranch alone, save for his ranch hand, old Thomas Briggs, a weathered man of 60 who chewed tobacco and spoke in proverbs and never once asked Jesse how he was feeling, a quality Jesse had come to regard as the highest form of human decency. The ranch sat on 400 acres of rolling grassland just south of Redemption Creek, a small frontier town of maybe 300 souls, with a single muddy main street lined with a general store, a blacksmith, a 2-story saloon called the Devil's Rest, a sheriff's office with iron bars on the windows, and a white clapboard church that the Reverend Solomon Hayes filled every Sunday morning with equal parts hellfire and tenderness. Jesse had cattle, a good well, a solid barn, and a farmhouse that was clean but cheerless, a place where a man slept and ate and rested his boots, but where nothing truly lived. It was Thomas who first suggested the advertisement. They had been mending fence along the north pasture one afternoon in late spring of 1873, the Colorado sky enormous and blue above them, the smell of sage and dry earth rising in the warm air, when Thomas said, without looking up from his work, "A man needs a woman in that house, Jesse. Not for himself, maybe, but for the house. A house without a woman in it goes cold, same as a fire without wood." Jesse had not responded. He had kept hammering the post with steady, mechanical strikes until Thomas added quietly, "Margaret would not have wanted you to turn a stone." Jesse had set the hammer down then and stared out across the grassland for a long time and said nothing at all. But that night, sitting alone at the kitchen table with a lamp burning low and the wind pressing against the windows, he had taken out a sheet of paper and begun to write. He had placed a modest advertisement in a Denver newspaper and 2 Eastern papers, stating plainly that a Colorado rancher of sound character and stable means sought a wife for practical partnership, a woman willing to work, willing to keep a home, and willing to accept that affection would not be part of the arrangement. He had written it the way he might write a business contract, because that was precisely what he intended it to be. He expected nothing. He hoped for nothing. He simply required order, and a woman could provide order in a house the way a man sometimes could not. Dozens of letters came. He read them all with the same detached expression, setting most aside after the first paragraph. Many of the women wrote prettily about love and adventure and the romance of frontier life, and those letters he disliked most of all, because they told him the women had not truly read his advertisement. They were not looking for what he was offering. They were looking for a story. Then came the letter from a woman named Clara Ashford, posted from a small town in western Pennsylvania, and everything changed in the quiet, irreversible way that real things change. Not with thunder, but with a single sentence that slips past every wall a man has built around himself. Clara wrote without pretense or decoration. She explained that she was 37 years old, a widow herself, that she had lost her husband and her infant son to a fever 3 years prior, and that she had been surviving since then by taking in mending and washing for neighbors who paid her in flour and pity, and that she had grown weary of both. She was not, she admitted, the kind of woman men wrote poems about. She was plain and practical, and sometimes too direct for polite company. But she knew how to tend a garden, dress a wound, preserve meat for winter, keep accounts, and sit with a dying animal without flinching. She knew how to be quiet when quiet was needed and how to speak plainly when speaking was called for. And then, in that final line that undid him entirely, she had written the words that trembled in his hands like a living thing. "I will never ask you to love me." She had understood, from his cold and contractual advertisement, exactly what kind of man he was. And she had offered herself to that man anyway, with her eyes open and her expectations buried alongside everything else she had lost. Jesse wrote back the same evening. He told her the terms clearly: the ranch, the work, the winters, the isolation. He told her he was not a demonstrative man, and that she should not expect warmth from him. He told her the nearest town was 4 miles of rough trail, that the nearest doctor was 20 miles further, and that the land was beautiful and merciless in equal measure. He told her all of this, so she could not later say she had not been warned. Clara's reply came 3 weeks later, and it contained only 2 sentences. Asterisk, "I have been warned by life itself, Mr. Weston. I will arrive on the 14th of September. Asterisk." The stagecoach from Denver rolled into Redemption Creek on a Thursday afternoon with a skin of red dust on its sides and the smell of long travel about it. Jesse stood outside the stage office with his hat in his hands, not out of sentiment, but because the wind had been pulling at it all morning and he had grown tired of the battle. He watched the passengers descend one by one: a merchant in a city suit, a young couple with a crying infant, an elderly preacher with a black bag. And then Clara Ashford stepped down from that coach and stood on the dusty street of Redemption Creek, Colorado, and looked around her with the calm, measuring eyes of a woman who has already made her peace with whatever she finds. She was, as she had promised, plain. Her dark hair was pulled back tightly beneath a traveling bonnet. Her dress was gray and practical. Her hands, when she removed her gloves, were the hands of a woman who worked, reddened at the knuckles, strong at the wrist. There was a small scar above her left eyebrow that she made no effort to conceal. She was not beautiful in the way that stopped a man's breath, but there was something in the set of her jaw and the steadiness of her gaze that made Jesse feel, for reasons he could not immediately explain, that she was the most solid thing he had seen in a very long time. They were married that evening by Reverend Solomon Hayes in the little white church, with Thomas Briggs and the Reverend's wife as witnesses. There was no celebration, no music, no flowers. Clara had brought one trunk and a small wooden box she kept close to her at all times, and which Jesse did not ask about. They rode back to the ranch in the wagon under a vast and starlit sky, and did not speak for most of the journey. When they arrived, Jesse showed her the house, the bedroom he had given her, his own, which he had moved out of and into the smaller back room without explanation, and told her breakfast was at 5:30 and that Thomas liked his coffee black. Then he said good night and closed the door and lay in the dark of his small back room, listening to the silence of the house and finding, against all his intention, that it felt different than it had the night before. Less empty, somehow, as though something had shifted in the air without asking his permission. Clara did not try to change him. That was the first thing Jesse noticed, and it disarmed him entirely because he had been braced for it, for the rearranging of furniture, for the softening attempts, for the gentle campaigns of warmth that women in stories waged against cold men and always, eventually, won. Clara did none of those things. She simply moved through the house and the ranch with quiet competence, rising before dawn, working without complaint, asking practical questions, and accepting practical answers. She kept the kitchen in a state of order that made Jesse secretly grateful. She learned the names of every horse within the first week and spoke to them in a low voice when she thought no one was listening. She began a kitchen garden along the south wall of the house, working the hard ground with a determination that made Thomas Briggs watch from a distance and shake his head in quiet admiration. What she did not do was pretend. She did not perform happiness. She did not manufacture cheerfulness. On mornings when the weight of whatever she carried showed on her face, she simply carried it and kept working, and Jesse respected that more than he could say, because it was the only language he himself had spoken for 6 years. They lived for those first weeks in a careful and courteous silence. Two people who had both been broken by the same world and had each, separately, learned that the best response to breaking was simply to keep moving. It was in the third week of October that everything shifted. A late-season storm rolled down from the mountains without much warning, the kind of violent Colorado weather that turned the sky green before it turned it black, and Jesse was out on the North Range trying to move cattle to lower ground when the full force of it struck. A bolt of lightning came down not 20 yards from his horse, and the animal threw him hard against the frozen ground. He lay there in the dark and the driving sleet for a time that he could not measure, with a broken rib grinding against his side every time he breathed and the cold working its way through his coat like a patient enemy. He managed to crawl to a shallow cut in the rock face and wait, and when the storm finally broke near midnight, it was Clara who found him. She had ridden out alone in the dark with a lantern and a horse she had only known for 3 weeks, in a weather that would have turned most people back to their beds. She had gone because Thomas was down with a bad knee and could not ride, and because Jesse had not come home, and apparently that was reason enough. She found him by the lantern light, half frozen and too proud to call out, and she got him onto the horse with a strength that surprised them both, and she rode him home through the cold black night without a word of reproach or alarm, only her jaw set and her eyes forward and her hands steady on the reins. She set his rib herself, with Thomas talking her through it, and she kept watch by his bed through the rest of that night and into the gray morning, and when Jesse finally opened his eyes fully and found her sitting there in the wooden chair by the window with her hands folded in her lap and her eyes quiet, he said the only thing that came honestly to him, "You didn't have to do that." And Clara looked at him steadily and said, "You're my husband, Jesse. What else would I do?" It was such a simple thing to say, and yet it went through him like light through a window that has been dark for a very long time. In the weeks of his recovery, they talked, slowly at first, cautiously, the way two people talk when they have learned that words can also be weapons. She told him about Pennsylvania, about her first husband, a gentle schoolteacher named Robert who had loved her quietly and well, and about the baby they had buried in the churchyard in the November rain. She told it without self-pity, in the same direct way she did everything. But her voice changed when she spoke of the child, became smaller, softer, like a candle flame in a draft, and Jesse felt something move in his chest that he had spent 6 years learning to suppress. He told her about Margaret, about Chickamauga, about the winter and the cottonwood tree. He had never told anyone the whole of it. He told her all of it, and she listened without trying to fix it or soften it. And when he finished, she simply said, "We have both been asked to carry a great deal." And he said, "Yes." And somehow that was enough. By the time the Christmas snows came to Redemption Creek, there were small changes in the Weston house that Jesse could not fully account for, but that he noticed the way a man notices warmth returning to a numb hand, gradually, with some pain, but undeniably. There was a quilt on the back of the chair by the fire that Clara had made from scraps she found in Margaret's old sewing basket, and instead of feeling like an intrusion, it felt like a kind of continuation. There was the smell of baking bread in the mornings that made Thomas Briggs arrive an hour early for no reason he would admit to. There was the wooden box Clara had brought from Pennsylvania, which she finally opened one evening by the fire and showed Jesse its contents. A small Bible with a cracked spine, a photograph of Robert, a lock of the baby's hair tied with a blue ribbon, and a pressed wildflower she could not name that she had found growing beside her husband's grave and had kept because it seemed important that something beautiful had grown in that place. Jesse looked at these things for a long time, and then he rose from his chair without saying anything and went to the mantelpiece and took down the small portrait of Margaret that he had not looked at directly in 3 years, and he set it beside Clara's Bible on the table, and he sat back down. Clara looked at him. He looked at the fire. Neither of them spoke. Neither of them needed to. Spring came to Redemption Creek the way it always did. Explosively, riotously, with wildflowers splitting the prairie open and the creek running high and cold from the mountain snowmelt. Jesse was riding fence on the southern pasture one afternoon in April when he came over a low rise and saw Clara in the kitchen garden below, kneeling in the dark earth with her sleeves rolled and her bonnet pushed back off her head, and the afternoon sun catching the dark of her hair, and she was laughing at something, at one of the chickens who had escaped the coop and was investigating her seedlings with great authority. And the sound of her laughter came up to him across the warm spring air like something he had forgotten existed, something he had not heard in his own life for so long that he had almost stopped believing it was real. He sat on his horse on that rise for a long time, watching until she looked up and saw him there, and she raised her hand in a simple wave, the way a person waves to someone they belong to, and Jesse felt the last of the stone inside him crack open the way the frozen creek cracks in the first warmth of spring, suddenly, completely, and with a sound like something that has been held too long finally being set free. He did not say the words that evening, because he was not yet a man who could say them easily. But he came to the kitchen garden after supper and helped her stake the bean plants in the fading light, and when their hands reached for the same stake at the same moment and touched, he did not pull away. And Clara looked at him in the quiet way she had, and he looked back, and between two people who had both survived the unsurvivable and found their way to the same Colorado sunset, there was nothing more that needed saying. Love, when it comes to people who have already lost everything, does not arrive with speeches or grand gestures. It arrives like spring does, gently, persistently, and against all reasonable expectation. Before we reach the end of this story, I want to ask you something from the heart. Tell us in the comments where you are watching from and what lesson this story left with you. Was it about not giving up on love? About the quiet courage of starting over? About the way two broken people can become something whole together? Your words might be exactly what someone else needs to read today. By the summer of 1874, the Weston Ranch had changed in ways that went deeper than the kitchen garden and the quilt and the sound of laughter. Jesse had filed a claim on an additional 100 acres to the east, and he and Thomas and two new hands were working the land with a purpose Jesse had not felt since before the war. In September of that year, exactly 1 year to the week from Clara's arrival in Redemption Creek, Jesse came to the kitchen on a quiet Sunday morning and found her standing at the window looking out at the cottonwood tree on the eastern edge of the property, Margaret's tree, with her hands resting gently at her sides and a look on her face that was soft and wondering and something else he could not quite name. He came to stand beside her, and he looked at the tree too, and then she took his hand and she placed it carefully, deliberately against the curve of her waist, and she looked up at him with those steady, clear eyes, and in them Jesse Weston read the most astonishing sentence of his entire life. He stood very still for a long moment, his hand warm against her side, the morning light coming gold through the kitchen window, the old cottonwood standing patient and eternal in the autumn air. And then Jesse Weston, who had buried love and hardness together like seeds in frozen ground, who had written a cold advertisement for a Loveless arrangement and received in return the greatest gift his broken life had ever known. That man dropped his forehead gently to Clara's and closed his eyes, and 2 tears ran down a face that had forgotten how, and he whispered the words he had been slowly, painfully, gratefully learning to mean again. "Thank you," he said, "for coming, for staying, for all of it." And Clara pressed her hand over his and said simply, "I told you I would not. Ask you to love me." And Jesse pulled back just enough to look at her, and he said, with all the quiet certainty of a man who has traveled through the dark and found the morning, "And I am telling you, I do." The child, a son, was born the following spring, in the same bedroom where Clara had first placed Jesse's portrait of Margaret beside her own wooden box, in the house at the edge of Redemption Creek, Colorado, on a morning when the wildflowers were coming up through the last of the snow, and the creek was singing over its stones, and the old cottonwood was putting out its first green leaves of the season, as it always did, as it always would. Patient, rooted, reaching toward the light.